So thank you very much for inviting me to come and talk today. A little bit like Penny, I'm not a wound care specialist at all, so I've been invited to come along and talk about an approach and a model that we're developing at the University of Leeds around patient-led approach to innovation, both in treatments, product innovation, service delivery. So it was very interesting being here yesterday. I didn't feel obliged to go to all of the presentations because some of them weren't going to mean a lot to me. But what was interesting was being able to go to some of the presentations, go and look at the posters and go and talk around the stands, was that I began to hear words and phrases that will tie in nicely to what I'm going to talk about today, which is about people beginning to say the value of listening to the patient, somebody talking about the importance of checking out the acceptability of the products they were developing from a patient point of view, because that's the person who's going to use them at the end of the day. Somebody talking about the value of patient engagement in their research because they'd had a 100% response rate to a questionnaire, which is fairly unheard of when you're dealing with ordinary professional staff, but isn't unusual when it comes to patients. They get very engaged, they're very enthusiastic, they're very motivated to work with us in terms of service delivery, treatment innovations, product innovations. So I'm going to talk a little bit about involving patients with leg ulcers in developing the new innovations and just cover a little bit, a tiny bit around some background to patient and public involvement, but nothing too much on that. Again, about how we go about hearing the patient voice and how that's difficult and why sometimes our innovations, when we try out and develop new things service-wise or product-wise, that they maybe go a little astray because we've lost sight and not heard the patient voice. A little bit about what's in a name. Why do I talk about patient-led innovation as opposed to just patient and public involvement? A bit about the model that we're developing and the context around a particular leg ulcer project that we did with Bradford Royal Infirmary. The concept of patient and public involvement isn't new. It goes back to the disability movement to a large extent, its roots is, but it's becoming very prevalent in health and social care, all public sector, government policy, etc. And it's very much the latest sort of enshrinement of it is in the Health and Social Care Act, talking about we need to have a greater voice for patients. It should be grounded in a systematic approach to patient involvement so that shared decision-making is the norm. And I'm going to extend that a bit further today and say I'm not so much looking at individualised patient care and their involvement in their treatment and their care plans, but at their involvement from the beginning to the end in development and changes to services and treatments around, in this instance, leg ulcers, or with industry in terms of the development of new products. So it's broader than just looking at people in their own individualised care plan. And there's probably some underpinning assumptions that I go into this presentation with, and some may agree with this and some may not, but I'm no doubt we can have a healthy discussion later. But I would argue that innovation requires some honest collaborative working between the different stakeholders. And in terms of the people in the room today, that's between clinicians, industry, higher education, and patients. I've not put patients there deliberately because they very rarely get mentioned as a stakeholder when we're looking at service innovation and product innovation. And the reason it needs that collaborative working is because service innovation creates opportunity and the capacity for product innovation. So it's an opportunity for the industry, but it's also the other way around. When industry develop new products, if they're a good product, it perhaps creates the opportunity for us to deliver services and treatments differently. And where patient and public involvement comes in is it provides a focus, it adds some value, and it gives them perhaps a better chance of that innovation being fit for purpose. That what starts off as a good idea doesn't get lost along the way, and then we have a product at the end of the day or a new type of service that isn't actually doing what we wanted it to do in the first place. What are some of the reasons why things go astray? Well, some of it is around the culture, perhaps, that we work in healthcare, which is the professional voice is usually a lot louder and heard a lot more than the patient voice. So even though in terms of numbers, there'll be far more patients out there with leg ulcers, an experience of leg ulcers, and there are people in industry, NHS and HE, who are involved in the treatment and the service provision of leg ulcers, and yet it's the professional voice that we hear. So what you tend to have is a patient carer voice. They may have a very good idea. They're living with the experience of a chronic leg ulcer. Lots of these folk either themselves or their families have a whole wide range of experiences and professions, engineers, goodness knows what other sort of things. They have their own ideas. They have their own workarounds sometimes for making their daily life better, for making that product or some issue work better for them. So they have they'll tell a story about their experiences, and I shall bring some quotes later that I feel illustrate this nicely. I know, and it's like, it hits you between the eyes sometimes when you actually take time out and listen to a patient's story. But what happens is that voice gets lost amongst a sea of other voices, or in this case, rapeseed field. We lose the beauty of the idea and the essence of it, and very often the simplicity of it, or the observation or the feedback, because it gets drowned out by the professional voices. So when we do ask, we don't often see it through to the end. There we go. And what's some of the reasons behind that? Now, I ought to be careful getting into talking about psychological investment. So I ought to say I'm talking about that from quite a lay perspective, as opposed to an expert in psychology. But if we take those phrases up here as sort of a very simplistic approach to the development of an idea, and clearly there's proper models of innovation out there, but at a very simple sort of level, if you're as a clinician perhaps looking at how you might deliver services differently, or as an industry in your products, there's an idea generation phase. Somebody comes up with an idea, or you may have a specific period of time where you set to and you look at, well, what might we do differently? How might we address this? Then there's perhaps a bit of prototyping going on. It's a bit more industry language, but developing what a product might look like, a sort of a rough sketch of it, or how a new service, how we might change it, how we might move from a hospital-based service to a community-based service. So a bit of prototyping, what it might look like. Then there's some testing of it out, feasibility, piloting. Again, it depends on your background as to what language that you might use. And then we get to some sort of rollout of it. Now, when there is patient and public involvement, there's a great tendency for it to only happen somewhere around here. It doesn't very often happen around there. And that's important because the further on we go in the development of an idea or a product or a service, the greater two things are. There's a greater level of resource investment, and whilst everyone's very aware of the cost of late failure, if you ask a patient here who gives some feedback and says, well, actually, no, I'm not so sure about that. It'd be a lot better if you could just do X. You spent that much money and that much time getting to here, there's a marked reluctance to go and have a fundamental redesign. So it either gets lost, it's a bit like the poppy, great idea, but gets lost in the sea of voices or the loud professional voices, or it gets fudged. Whereas if the ideas come in here, it's much easier to incorporate the feedback, the suggestions, the learning from the lived experience before we start on the development process. There's also a psychological investment. The longer we spend talking about our great idea, the more wedded to it we get. And the more wedded we get to it, the harder it is to let go of it. So I was talking with a colleague, and they have an initiative going on in the University of Leeds at the moment around trying to develop a way of rewarding people for failing their idea. Whereas actually, we do the opposite. You get all the credit for proving why your idea is good. So if even around here, somebody's saying, what about, have you considered? We tend to start defending and saying why our idea is good and why it will work. And the more we do that, the more enthusiastic we get about it. So we're then very resistant to doing anything here. And you sort of see this at a government level. Once the minister comes in, decides to do some NHS reforms, educational reforms, and the clinical staff and all the people saying, but what about? You don't appreciate this. And the more they do that, the more they bed in and dig in and defend themselves. And things get put in place that everyone says, actually, some of that was a good idea, but there's some bits that weren't, because they don't want to lose face. It's seen as not okay. You've put your idea forward, and you must therefore champion it. And whereas actually it's a strength to be able to press the pause button and go, actually, maybe it wasn't such a great idea, and it's much better we've found out now before we put loads of time and energy into something that isn't going to be fit for purpose. And I'm going to raise a couple of issues that sort of illustrate that a little bit. So things that can go wrong because we haven't perhaps involved or listened to the experience beforehand. So these are both good ideas, pendant alarms, and I'm sort of talking about the early days of pendant alarms because they've moved on a bit. But generally, great idea. Somebody falls over and has some falls 2 or 3 times in their home. If you could do something that enabled help to get to them quicker, then the consequences in health, social well-being, etc., would be less. However, the industry made loads of money because social services, once you'd fallen a couple of times, issued out these pendant alarms like mad. Most of us in the room will have had a granny who's had a pendant alarm issued to her. So companies happy because it's had lots of sales and made lots of money. Social services are happy because they've fulfilled their tick box criteria. You've fallen twice, here you are, here's a pendant alarm. The family's happy because granny's been issued with something. What happens next time granny falls? She hasn't got a pendant alarm on. Why doesn't she have a pendant alarm on? Because it's a little bit like these. Oops. Every time you bend forward, it bangs into something. So it's inconvenient if you're trying to cook, do whatever around the house. In the early days, looked pretty ugly. So it has a bit of sign saying old and incapable. People don't like being labelled old and incapable, and aesthetically looked pretty ugly. So my granny, for once, was one of those who invariably didn't have it on for all of those reasons. So a great idea that didn't have initially the benefit it should have done, because clearly nobody had trialled it out with patients and said, what does it like to use? Because there were too many of them that weren't using it. So now you've got to other designs. They moved on to things like bracelets and other ways of making them more discreet, less intrusive, and hopefully aesthetically perhaps a bit better than that. And then what did we do? In amongst all that, we blamed Granny. We didn't ask, could we have designed the product better so it was more acceptable, a better way of being used? Similar bit with orthotic footwear. I was talking to an orthotist the other day. Lots of time and effort and money goes into trying to provide and design good orthotic footwear for individuals because of the impact on their lives. Quite relevant to some of the leg ulcer patients I was working with. They had difficult feet. I never quite found a word. I'm not sure what the proper word is, but we settled on difficult feet. You get one pair of orthotic shoes every 2 years because of the cost. They tend to look a bit like or they certainly used to look a bit like a medical device, certainly not something you'd particularly go and choose to buy in the high street. And they'd come back and see him at the end of 2 years, and you go, what's it been like? And he's going, no, they've been fine. No, they've been all right. And he's thinking, I can tell that they spent more time in the box than they have on your feet. So they maybe physically fitted you, but aesthetically, you weren't comfortable wearing them. And again, the study showed some patients, didn't want to go to a wedding, got the lovely suit and everything, but was so embarrassed about his footwear. Another person who'd bought a really expensive pair of shoes and sort of squeezed his foot into them, the leg ulcer leaked, ruined the leather shoes, because apparently you can't get the odour out of leather shoes very easily. So good ideas that went awry and didn't have the benefit that they could have had if there'd been more involvement at the beginning. So how to maximise the value of patient and public involvement? Well, one of it is bring it in as early as possible in the process, rather than as a bit of an afterthought at the end. Because patients and carers aren't daft. They sort of know when they're being brought in as an afterthought, and it doesn't always get the best out of them, just as it wouldn't us. We complain plenty of times in our workplaces when somebody eventually gets round to asking us, well, they've built the bloody hospital now, and now they ask me where I think things should go in the ward. They didn't come and ask me before. So, I'll talk it. So the chronic leg ulcer group, we got asked by Medilink, it's the regional wound care group, sorry, it's not, it's the regional health technology organisation. So it works with organisations across the health technology sector. And they've been doing work with professionals across the sector on wound care. And they came and said, would you do something about finding out what the patients think are the priorities? So we're pretty clear what the professionals think. So I went and worked with Professor Bowden, Peter Bowden and Kath Bowden over at Bradford, and it was their wound care clinics that we went to. And we recruited a number of patients, and we went and did a presentation initially and just said, we don't know where this project's going to go. What we'd like to do is spend some time with you understanding what's it like to live with a chronic leg ulcer, and what would you like to be different? And we're hoping that might then influence and have some legs, that's a bad pun, have some mileage in terms of being able to have a positive impact either on product development or service development. So we took them through a learning journey process, which is part of what we do. And in essence, we had 3 sessions with them, and it's a semi-facilitated conversation. So we bring the cohort of people together and encourage them to tell their story in terms of what is it like to live with, what's everyday experience of it. And so you've got some of that social impact, because actually they had a great time. You know, and even people, there was somebody there who'd had a leg ulcer for 40 years saying, oh, I didn't realise that was as common as that, when other people in the room think, oh, yeah, that's happened to me as well. And we're trying to just get them to talk about their ideas, what it's like living with it, and what's the impact of these things that they're describing. How does it impact on their everyday lives? And therefore, and then looking for where might some of the areas be for innovation in terms of what's important to them. Now, the important part of this learning journey process, in contrast is to, as I understand, happens very often, particularly with industry and product development, is we're looking to establish a relationship. It's not a one-off focus group where we just get a group of people together and we spend some time. It's about establishing relationship, gaining some momentum. And as you establish momentum, you begin to get some trust with people. The more you trust somebody, the little bit more you're likely to disclose things to them. And we don't necessarily mean earth-shattering disclosures, but actually they talk a bit more freely and you get insights into little things that make a difference. So one example would be that came out on the 3rd session after lots and lots of quite obvious things that were hitting us. Was somebody talking about putting their compression stockings on as a man and feeling like the problem of hairy legs because it bends the hairs back up and back into the skin and puts him at risk of exactly the thing that he's trying to avoid. Should he as a man shave his legs? 80, he wasn't very keen on the idea. But, but he hadn't mentioned that, and he was quite open, but that was just a bit too embarrassing for him for the sessions 1 and 2. It was only as he began to feel comfortable and trust us all. And then what we did, as a part of that sort of final phase, was say, if you could wave a magic wand, it's the old magic question, what would you want to be different that would improve your everyday experience, both of living with a leg ulcer or for some of them, that length of time that you might get ulcer-free? Because some of them had the experiences. The people who participated were for between 2 and 40 years experience they had of chronic leg ulcers. So they sort of knew the pattern. And the 3 priority areas that they came out with was compression stockings, footwear, and odour from leaking wounds. And to the best of my knowledge and the general conversations I have with people, that isn't where the majority of the money is being spent. Having said that, all of the professionals, when we put it back to them, go, oh yeah, absolutely. We know that's an issue. We hear it in the clinic. We do hear those stories, but they hear it, but it isn't influencing where a lot of the money goes. And it isn't that the patients weren't interested in having their wound healed, but after experiences of 2 to 40 years, they'd sort of come to the realization that it probably wasn't going to happen in their lifetime. And what was more important was their everyday quality of life, which is why these things started to come out as a higher priority, and very much in that order. And interestingly, I've heard a lot about pain these last 2 days. Once it got mentioned, it wasn't the most important thing for this particular group. I'm sure if we go and test, roll it out elsewhere, then a different group may identify different things. So a few quotes just to see how the importance of the stockings. So the hospital can put dressings on. They don't have a problem putting the dressings on, but for me to put stockings on, it's a bigger problem. It's hard work. Most of these patients that I was working with have comorbidities. Their age means there's other things. For a lot of them, it's arthritis. It becomes very difficult, the bending over, the pulling on of the stockings, the pulling them off. There's got to be an answer. I've had a terrible time this week. Oh, and pain. And pain down my thumbs. It's been absolutely excruciating. I find it difficult to bend over and do anything. They're very, very hot. And then other things around, the appearance, etc. And I know, companies talk about they've been working on what they look like, etc. But for some people, they still feel they're walking around with a medical device on their leg. It's very obvious that there's something up with them. Now, as a non-wound care specialist, I have to say this one absolutely hit me between the eyes. One lady described how she has to trap her stockings under her bed and then lean backwards to remove them from her legs. So my next question to the Vowdens was, how many people break their broken neck of femur with chronic leg ulcers and these stockings? There didn't seem to be any stats for that. But you sort of think, if you're 70 and 60 and 80 or what have you, and this is what you're doing, because that's the only way you can get your stockings off, there's got to be some other problems going on. She talked to very much a resilient lady. She was very much going to deal with it and cope with it, as we heard earlier. but this can't be a great way of living your everyday life. Another lady talked about her legs were healed at present, but she still needs to wear them from a compression point of view. But again, she dreads taking them on and off. And if her son's not around to help her, she's sort of got past the embarrassment now of having to have her son help her take them on and off, but they stay on if he's not about. Or they don't go on in the first place, possibly. I won't spend much time on this. Footwear, I'd love to have shoes that look smart. We've done a bit of work with this. We had a footwear conference where we had HE, industry, NHS in. I shall jump that. So this brings us sort of the growing model that we're developing around this work. So we've done it in other topic areas, but from the leg ulcer work is, if we spend time looking and understanding the patient experience and perspective, and really understanding it, and one of the advantages of me doing the work is, I'm a nurse by background, but mental health is, I don't have a specialist knowledge. I don't have knowledge that I need to try and park around it and listen and actually hear what they're saying. And what we get from that is patient-identified need. So we talk a lot about clinical identified need, but this is patient-identified need. And then we look at bringing in the stakeholder perspective. So this patient group have now worked with an international wound care company. They sign non-disclosure agreements, looking at their products, etc., and giving feedback on them. Then there's something about the health economics and the prevalence of the needs. Because we're not talking individualised patient care plans, we are talking about how can we improve services and products. So we have to be honest in the real world, there's a finance issue. So, is there enough people, enough patients expressing this need that makes it viable for the NHS to change its services or for a company to design some new products? Then it's about involving them at each of those stage gates. So you've got your idea generation, all the crucial decision making, keeping that patient community involved to make sure, like your neck alarms, you stay true to a good idea. A good idea doesn't get lost and isn't as effective as it could be. They're great for marketing of innovations. You get almost like a patient mark, patient validation. So I've done some work with a reflex company who wanted the patient insight and understanding their experience as a way of seeing if they should market their product in a different way for it to make sense and have resonance. They're also very helpful in terms of adoption and diffusion. They have different ways. They interact with different people. The patient voice influences where the money goes now. And I have about 1, maybe 2 minutes to go, so I shall be very rapidly through this. Some underpinning principles, and this is important because it's often why you find it difficult to do in the workplace, wherever your workplace is there's a genuine recognition that patients have an expertise. And it's an expertise that comes from lived experience. It's different, but equally valid to the clinical expertise or the industry expertise in terms of their knowledge around clinical conditions. I'm not saying more important, but it's equally valid. And when you have that in place, you start to get to a point of mutual respect. If you have mutual respect, you get far more genuine sharing of ideas. People trust each other. That then takes us, involvement should be a positive experience. It isn't always for patients. They'll talk about feeling used and abused, bled dry for their thoughts and opinions and no feedback, nothing coming back to them. By having a relationship and it being an ongoing piece of work with patients, they find it a positive experience. And it's that ongoing relationship that's critical to that. So, potential value. I'm not suggesting that everything should begin with the patient. Some people might do, but I think there's a time and a place, and other people's expertise is relevant. What I'm suggesting is it's not intended as an instead of, but as a different starting point that might lead to some new insights and generate some different things. If you start somewhere different, you might finish somewhere different. And a product or treatment or service, an innovation is only as good as it's used. And if it isn't used as you intended by the patient because it isn't acceptable for them, describing them as being non-compliant is a somewhat judgmental term. We should ask ourselves, well, what could we have done differently about the treatment, the service that we've designed, or the product that we've designed, so it is acceptable and it's easy for the patients to use. If patients are not doing something, it's more about the fact it's difficult to do, as opposed to us labelling them as non-compliant. Thank you.